Airline pilots of Reddit, what was your biggest we're all funked up moment that you survived and your passengers didn't notice? Not a pilot but a flight attendant. We landed, everything went smoothly, as we're deplaning the pilot steps out of the flight deck and goes, "Wow, I am glad we made it, we lost 2 hydraulics on the way down." Mine is from many years ago when I was a student pilot. I was 14 I think at the time. I had about 15-ish hours done and getting close to soloing for the first time but still had a few hours and more landings to practice. I was doing some basics and getting ready to come back with my instructor to practice some touch and goes for a bit. Coming back through we had to pass through DTW's Bravo airspace, means need permission to go through it. A few minutes before I was about to call for permission, my instructor got really quiet. I looked over at him and he looked really bad. I thought he was going to puke, so looking for a bag. But then I notice he isn't breathing. I figure out where I am at and call up DTW approach. Declare a medical emergency and that my instructor was not breathing. I also told them I am a student and never landed on my own before, and never in a large airport. Detroit approach was amazing at helping me. They gave me an option for DTW or Willow, but Willow would have added a good 5 to 10 minutes since I was coming in from the SE. Opted for DTW and they were great at giving me vectors while also getting the big jets out of the way. I remember hearing them tell several planes to go around and several more into a hold. Anyway, did my approach and made the most butter-smooth landing I have ever made in my life, even till this day. Ambulance was right there on the taxi waiting for me. Turns out my instructor, who was only 25, had a heart attack. He ended up being okay. All from first call to him and the ambulance was less than 10 minutes thanks to ATC and DTW Tower. Edit. Thank you so much kind strangers for the gold and silver, it's my first for both. I'm a CFI at this point and I'm flying with a student. We see a spider in the cockpit. I'm okay with spiders but I don't want it distracting the student, so I'm shit. Student missed the spider but saw my movement and asked what it was. I responded it was a spider, I killed it as I'm glancing into the backseat area. I managed to casually add, "Why, are you scared of spiders?" without the student noticing the break in the sentence. Turns out the student is scared of spiders. For the rest of that flight I squished spiders behind my student's back as they came forward from the nest I had just spotted in the back of the plane. He never knew. I was in the process of getting my PPL, private pilot license, and I was flying circuits solo. Before I took off, the CFO of the flight school asked me if I was sure it was a good idea to fly. It's pretty windy. I was flying a Cessna 152 on a day with wind pushing 15 kts and turbulence around 20. I honestly don't know what I or anyone at the flight school was thinking letting me, 16 years old, take off. Anyways, a few bumpy circuits go by with no problem. I actually got some great practice landing in turbulence. So the last circuit of the day, I'm on final with full flaps doing the absolute minimum speed for approach in a 152, not taking into consideration that the air is super turbulent. For those who don't know, when it's bumpy you should be going a little faster on approach than usual. Anyways, I'm quite close to the ground, maybe 300 to 400 feet, and I can hear the wind blowing over the sound of the engine. Suddenly, no wind. I had just lost 15-20 kts of almost direct headwind on final approach with absolutely no airspeed to spare. I remember my shirt sleeves looked like they were inflating and the plane's stall warning started screaming at me. The controls became totally useless, like a limp computer joystick. Thankfully I had my hand on the throttle like my instructor taught me, and for whatever instinctual reason, good instructor probably, I gently pushed the throttle all the way and slightly lowered the nose. All of this took place in the span of about 5 seconds. I remember what I did, but not thinking about doing it. It was like when you drive somewhere and you suddenly realize you've arrived without remembering driving. Scary. Anyways, I landed the plane just fine and went home and took a nap. My parents said I was pale as a ghost when I got home. Flying is fun until it isn't. Was learning to fly when I worked for the Gov. So on my first flight with me taking off, we've been climbing for about 5 minutes and we're going through some gentle turns when instructor says, "We're going to head back, I don't feel well." He takes over the stick and he looks ashen. He then starts to breathe erratically and says I need to help him control the plane. He radios tower and up till now I'm thinking it's a prank. Mayday, mayday. He talks me through the whole thing. I'm trying to talk to the tower, repeat info, read widgets, remember lessons, listen to him and hope he don't pass out. I was shitting myself. Takeoff is one thing, but landing? We land like a kangaroo with a rocket up its ass. I'm surprised the wheels didn't fold. Must have been 4 big bounces, but it's a big runway. Scrub speed, finally get the plane to stop and instructor passes out. He had an heart attack. He survived but only for a few months before I heard he passed away in his sleep. But he got us down. I never continued the lessons. Not completely on topic, but I was an aircraft mechanic for the Navy back in the day on A4 Skyhawks. Student pilot notices his canopy light is on, indicating his canopy isn't all the way closed and locked. He decided it might help if he cracked the canopy open just a little bit and close it again. I remember seeing it land as a convertible. We sent a couple of guys out in a pickup truck where they found the missing canopy in a farmer's field.
This entire story occurred in less than 10 seconds and should have ended with headlines on CNN. Military pilot and not commercial, but it still could have ended in a disaster. Flying a CH-47D Chinook helicopter in Iraq mid-July 2008 when the temp was over 130 degrees. Packed full with 36 passengers at an altitude of only 100 feet and speed of 140 knots, lower and faster than you'd ever fly in the US. We hit a thermal pocket of warm air that pushed us up, so I nosed the cyclic, looks like a joystick between your legs, forward to maintain altitude. I was a brand new pilot flying with a combat vet who wanted me to maintain altitude of 100 feet almost exactly, so no higher than 120 or lower than 80 feet. Nosing the aircraft down kept us from going higher, but we immediately hit a downdraft and the aircraft started to fall like a rock. I pulled back on the cyclic as hard as I could to get the nose up, but it hit my body armor and wouldn't go back any further. I watched the altimeter drop all the way to 19 feet and miraculously we started falling and began to climb at the last possible second. During the debrief, the other pilot, now one of my closest friends, who had well over 1,000 combat hours, told me he's never been so close to dying before. I wasn't shook up until I heard that. Even typing this today gives me chills.
Once, departing Burning Man in a private plane with a couple of passengers, my engine conked out. I didn't even follow the engine out checklist. I glanced at the fuel pressure gauge, didn't like what I saw, hit the switch for the auxiliary fuel pump, and it came back to life. The whole incident was over so fast the passengers never even noticed. I wouldn't call it a we're all f***ed moment, though. Worst case scenario, I would have had to set it back down on the playa, which is pretty flat terrain as far as the eye can see. I'm a commercial helicopter pilot. Probably the closest moment to we're f***ed I ever had was a few years ago. To set it up, I was ferrying a helicopter by myself to another location about 200 miles away. The helicopter I was flying was set up for IFR, instrument flying, and I'm a fairly experienced IFR captain. The helicopter I was in does not like ice. That means that flying in the clouds when it's below freezing is basically impossible. This was in the high Arctic, in the early spring. So basically always cold. Weather wasn't great, but I still wanted to give the trip a shot. If it was bad, I would just turn around and come home. About 50 miles out, the cloud ceiling was coming down, and visibility was dropping. I was over a small frozen lake, and I could see at the other end of the lake that the clouds were right to the ground. At this point I'm at about 300 feet above ground. I make the call to turn around, and start a left-hand turn, but as I'm halfway through the turn I enter cloud. Under normal circumstances, a VFR helicopter unintentionally entering cloud is often a death sentence, but I'm a trained IFR pilot in an IFR helicopter. I start a climb, as I know there is rising terrain on the side of the lake. I don't mind flying in cloud. What I do mind is the fact that my helicopter starts icing up instantly. I'm not talking about a bit of ice, I'm talking about a massive amount of ice, and a helicopter that doesn't like any ice. There is no way I can make it the 50 miles back to the airport to shoot an IFR approach, and I know the clouds are too thick to climb above them. I also can't descend because the ceiling is so low that I risk impacting the terrain if I don't pop out of the cloud soon enough. I'm running through the options in my head, but my heart rate is going up. This isn't something that normally happens. I'm not the type of pilot that gets into situations that scare me. I'm rapidly running out of time, so I head to a larger flat area, as indicated on my GPS and maps, set my radio altimeter, a device that tells you exactly how far above the ground you are, to beep at me when I reach 250 feet, and start descending. I figure if I don't break out by 300 feet, I'm in some serious trouble. As I'm approaching 300 feet, I break out of cloud. Good visibility, and a clear path all the way back to the airport. I do a normal approach and landing, and shut down at our hangar. The blades are covered in ice. After I change my underwear, we pull the helicopter into the hangar to let the ice thaw. The next day, the weather is beautiful, and the trip goes off without a hitch. After flying for 10 years and thousands of hours, it was the only time I was actually scared. I'm glad I didn't have any passengers on board at the time. Commercial pilot here, not the most exciting story, but because there aren't any good ones yet I'll reply. I was flying myself and 3 passengers over the Appalachian Mountain on a clear day. We hit some mild turbulence and the door opened to the cabin. The passengers all started panicking, so I basically said, "Chill out guys, this happens all the time," and tried closing the door. I couldn't get it shut while also flying the plane, so I simply landed at a nearby airfield and closed it on the ground. After the trip was over, I told the passengers that was the first time that had ever happened to me, and I was slightly panicked as well. Edit: I can answer any other questions while I'm here since many of you have DM'd some.
This was about 7 years ago now. I took my brother and 2 cousins up for a short sightseeing flight one morning in a Cessna 172. I knew there was some weather coming in, so I wanted to get it over with quickly. About 20 minutes in, I noticed the clouds getting worse and then some lightning off in the distance. Definitely time to head back. Heading back, I radioed my intentions, uncontrolled airport but with an FBO, and someone radioed back with the current winds. It didn't compute what they said, and in retrospect I should have asked for clarification. Get back to the airport, and as I'm on final I realize just how bad the wind is. Having a hard time keeping on centerline and eventually go around on the first try. By now I'm starting to sweating bullets and planning on rerouting if the next attempt doesn't go well. I make sure to turn the intercom off so my cousins in the back can't hear how panicked I'm becoming, though I did keep my cool through the whole thing. On second attempt I've got the rudder pegged to the left and managed to get the wheels on the ground safely. I taxi to park, shut down, jump out, and start shaking with adrenaline and let out a huge sigh of relief. Cousins had no idea what just happened. It was just an exciting flight to them. My brother kind of knew what was going on, and I let him in on what I was thinking later. Apparently I had an audience of guys from the FBO watching me as well, probably yelling at me to go somewhere else. I'm honestly surprised. And sometimes I managed that landing with no incidents, especially since that was basically my first crosswind landing.
I'm an airline pilot now, but my first job was flying banners. I have another good banner tow story, but I've told it before. I didn't have passengers, but I had viewers, and from their perspective, nobody noticed. One day as usual I was given the job of heading to a fairly distant location, unpacking and setting up my banner, and picking it up and flying it. Set up went like it usually does, and I took off to pick the banner up. In banner towing, the way it works is you've got a grappling hook at the end of a cable that's attached to the tail of the aircraft. You take off without the banner attached, and come back around, swooping down steeply toward a loop of rope you have set up on the ground held up between 2 posts, running down to the banner. At the last second, you yank the plane back skyward, and the hook is supposed to swing between the posts and hook the rope. On my pickup, I felt the satisfying pull of the banner as I leveled off, but something was wrong. It was pulling hard to the left side. A quick look to my left showed that I had missed with the hook, and instead caught the banner rope loop with my left main wheel. Even worse, instead of sliding up the gear leg to the fuselage, the rope had caught down near the wheel. I had been provided a steak knife for the purpose of cutting the rope, but there was no way I was going to be able to reach that rope. The plane was yawing hard, but it was under control, and I flew slow circles around the airport while I thought about my options. I could always try to land the plane with the banner attached, but from what I'd heard, that usually results in the plane tipping over onto its nose, ruining the engine and propeller at the very least, and probably causing a lot more damage, not to mention the risk to my own life. I couldn't cut the rope because I didn't have the reach. Then I remembered what I did have: a small toolkit and a roll of duct tape in the pocket behind my seat. I thought about what I could use those to do, and it occurred to me that the empty second seat behind me also had a metal tube control stick. Well, it would be worth a shot. I controlled the plane with my knees while I reached behind my seat to get the toolkit. Only a single bolt and nut secure the control stick to the tube below, but I had to access it blind, reaching below and behind me while also controlling the plane. After a couple of guesses as to which size socket to put on the ratchet, I had a good grab, and managed to get the nut off and extract the screw. A brisk pull-up dislodged the control stick. It was working. The stick was a couple feet long and I figured it would be enough to reach out the window and down to the rope. Still flying with my knees, I stuck the steak knife handle into the bottom end of the control stick, and wrapped a bunch of duct tape around the joint until I felt it would be secure. It was time to give it a try. I lined back up for my pickup sight and reaching as far out the left window as I could, while fighting the slipstream, I could just contact the rope. When I reached my target, I started sawing wildly at the rope, but it sliced through with surprising ease. I felt the plane lurch as the banner dropped back down to earth. I landed the plane and took a few minutes to breathe, thinking about what had just happened, and then what to do next. It occurred to me that I could tie a knot in the rope and just pick it up again. And that's what I did. Suffice it to say, I was a bit more careful this time, and everything went as planned. From the ground, the only thing anyone would have noticed is that a banner plane picked up a banner and just stayed in the area for a while, dropped the banner, then picked it up again and headed off. Long time ago, back in 1989, I was a first officer on the 747-100. We pushed back from the terminal in Anchorage and taxied out for a departure to Narita, Tokyo. We were full of people and very close to max takeoff weight. At the end of the runway, it was my takeoff. I stood on the brakes, stood the thrust levers up and the engineer set full takeoff power. Released the brakes and off we trundled. And we rolled, and rolled and rolled down the runway. It was not sparkling acceleration by any means. As the end of the runway loomed into sight and takeoff speed still some distance away. With the lights going. Red white red white red red red. The captain said, and I quote, "Best you rotate." We were a good 20 kts below VR. Not being a total numpty, I slowly and smoothly rotated and the beast flew away off the end of the runway like a lady. We slowly climbed away, cleaned up, turned and headed out west. Not a word was said for a long while. Finally, through 20,000 feet, the engineer launched himself at the my performance figures. Nothing was wrong, and we were at full power anyway. It turned out that extra cargo had been loaded in error, and we were well overweight. Apart from me wetting the seat and a raised heart rate, the passengers were none the wiser. Not quite with passengers but tiffy nonetheless. During my first solo flight ever, I was really excited and wanted to video record the special occasion. So there I was, taxiing down the taxiway with one hand holding my phone. One thing about old propeller planes is that they're just like old cars, and don't always drive straight. I suppose I was a little too concentrated on making sure my camera was properly angled and focused. Next thing I knew, my plane ended up rolling off the asphalt, into the f***ing grassy ditch. I panicked. How TF am I supposed to get this plane out of here? Over the radio, there was a silence, as the controller likely saw what happened from the tower. After a few seconds, probably still speechless at this point, she casually checked on me to make sure I was doing okay. To save my embarrassment, I tried to power up and drive out of the grass back to the asphalt. Much to my surprise, it worked. I did my short flying as planned and returned to the hangar where my instructor was waiting. I have no idea how many people saw what happened, but from the look on his face, I'm pretty sure he knew too. And yes, that video of me driving a plane into a ditch still exists somewhere. I suppose this is the airplane equivalent of don't text and drive. About 4 years ago, most airlines stopped overflying the Syrian airspace due to security issues and reported missiles spotted by pilots without any notification to airmen, provided by Syrian civil aviation authorities. My airline was one of the few ones that kept overflying Syria. They accused the other airlines of refraining from overflying the airspace to put some pressure on the Syrian regime for political reasons. A couple of weeks after the news, we started to hear a few pilots in my company reporting seeing missiles at night. After asking one of them, he said it was distant, bright and scary. He couldn't tell how far it was because it's very dark over the Syrian inhabited desert at night and the pilots have very few visual cues. A few days later, this was during the harsh times of the Syrian war, and Aleppo was being bombarded by shells and rockets. I was on a day flight which overflies Damascus at about 30,000 feet. I was very curious given the news and looked outside a lot. And suddenly I see this large vertical smoke and a bright object with a fire tail emitting all this smoke. It was climbing at a very fast rate. I screamed to the other pilot, "Look at that missile." It took about 5 seconds for that missile to get from close to the ground to somewhere around our altitude, and its trajectory to switching from vertical to what it seemed to be towards us. We both look at it through the front windshield and the other pilot slurred, "Get your camera." I tried to reach my phone for proof but I couldn't take my eyes off it. The missile seemed to be coming slightly from our left side and slightly below us, and being the first officer I asked, "Shall I turn right?" He answers, "Don't do anything." A couple of seconds more, the missile passes beam us to the left side, at a very close distance, and probably less than 500 feet above our altitude. I would say it was 1 nautical mile or less away. I could clearly see the details, the colors, the head, body, tail and the fire trail during daylight. An A320 that is 7 away from me at an airport was about the size I saw on that missile from the left windshield. Me and the captain both had the biggest "we are f***ed" moment in our life. After we landed I protested and refused to operate, and I was about to be more f***ed for putting my managers in a bad position. The passengers and the cabin crew had no idea what happened, and I remember the cabin crew on galley position that day was wondering why some pilots seem sad and angry and why we don't know some stuff that she perfectly knows in the cabin. I looked at her, I smiled and I said, "You're right lady, we should." The other pilot is now reaching his retirement. This near miss made us bond a lot. And we often see each other and request flights together. He often tells me that we survived a very close death call together. And that the cked missile was only a few hundred meters away. Although he tried to decrease the gravity of the situation on the investigation the day of the event, by omitting the distance information. The company dealt with it seriously and the Syrians decided to close an airway after their efforts. Maybe he did the smart thing. Forcing an airline CEO to do something can cost you your career. And nothing is more important for a pilot than his job stability, after avoiding a crash.